Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. 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 I do not feel mocked. I do not feel mocked by you, but I do not also. I'm here this afternoon for the convention of the Democratic National Committee, and you know, everything's fine. Everything's good. And I think, you know, the way I look at my candidacy, it took me 1.5 years to process it, so I can be patient with some other people who have to process it as well. I'm so grateful to those of you who have a deep understanding, which obviously you do, of why I'm running for president. And I feel that the politics that dominates our society today is too narrow a container for the conversations that we need to be having. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, in his speech to Congress, President Roosevelt said that our generation, he said, has a rendezvous with destiny. Our generation did not expect to have a rendezvous with destiny. We have appreciated the fact that other generations did, but we thought that we could pretty much coast on what others had done. We didn't think everything was perfect, but we figured somebody was watching the store. A lot of us thought of ourselves as just not political, or we thought of ourselves as changing the world in another way. We didn't feel that the change came from politics. And I think the last 2 years has been a gigantic awakening. You know, and the French have a saying, if you don't do politics, politics will do you. And I think that we have all seen that. All that politics is our collective behavior. That's all that politics is. And if we're responsible for our individual behavior, then I think we're responsible for our collective behavior. And the law of cause and effect works in both places. So whatever an individual does on some level comes back at you, and what a nation does comes back at you as well. And I think that in order to transform a nation, the same principles that we apply to our own circumstances to transform our own individual lives have to be called into play. All that a nation is a group of people, so the same psychological and emotional issues that transform one life transform a country. Politics should be the conduit and the channel for our transformation when transformation is needed. But at this point in our history, politics as we know it, conventional politics, is not only a conduit for our transformation, it is an obstruction to our transformation. That is why I'm running for president. I don't have a problem with the American people. I think the American people are just fine. The American people are who we are in issue after issue, poll after poll. We're kind of left of center. The problem is not the consciousness of the American people. The problem is the dangerous and critical gap that exists between the consciousness or the will of the American people and the way our political system operates. And that is, as we know, so that at this point, the very core value of American democracy, which is that our government would be a channel for the expression of a collective will through representative democracy, that is not working. That is blocked because, as we all know, our government now has been hijacked. It has been hijacked by an amoral economic system by which short-term profit maximization for huge corporate entities has more influence on the workings of our government than do we, the people of the United States. And in both domestic as well as international policy, the government, therefore, because of the undue influence of money on Washington, our government does more to advocate for the short-term profit maximization of those corporations than it does to advocate for us and to advocate for our children, our safety, our well-being, safety and well-being of the people of the world, and the safety and well-being of the planet on which we live. This is true to such an extent as to have eroded the basic core of our democracy, turning our democracy into more of a functioning corporatocracy or oligarchy than an actual functioning democracy. And it has brought us to a point where literally dangerous, whether it has to do with dangerous carcinogens in the water, dangerous carcinogens in the air, dangerous carcinogens in the food, literally whether it has to do with things happening to the planet that is actually brought because of climate crisis, brought us to the point where it is a legitimate question whether or not our children or our grandchildren's grandchildren would be able to inhabit this planet. It has gotten to the point, very similar to what happens when you have a friend who drinks or who does drugs to such an extent that you and other people that you know look at each other and say, do you think we should do something? And we all know what that means. It means, should we stage an intervention? It means, should we say to that person, you need to sit down and you need to listen to us. We're not going to sit here and watch this, because if you continue like this, you could die, and that will not happen on our watch. That is where we need to be about our democracy. And it serves us to realize that it has always been this way in American history. Slavery did not end because the conventional political establishment woke up one day and said, let's end slavery. That's not what happened. The abolitionist movement arose from the early evangelicals and the Quakers. In other words, the people rose up and the people stepped in. The same is true with women's suffrage. The US government did not wake up one day and say, let's give women the right to vote, shall we? That's not what happened. With the women's suffragette movement, the people rose up and the people stepped in. Same with institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South. The US government did not wake up one day and say, let us end segregation, shall we? No, that's not what happened. With Dr. Martin Luther King, a Baptist preacher, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement, the people rose up and the people stepped in. History would therefore inform us that it is foolish and naive to think that the current political establishment is going to fix itself. It is ridiculous, and I challenge the idea that only those whose careers have been entrenched for decades in the limitations of the very political mindset that has driven us into this ditch are the only people we should consider qualified to lead us out of this ditch. That is ridiculous. No. That's not the way it's going to happen. Very, very good, very well-intentioned people work and live within that system. But let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. The kind of fundamental pattern disruption of the economic and political and social status quo that we need now is not going to happen because one of them are willing to do it. It's going to happen because the people rise up and the people step in. This is the way it is. We have been trained to expect so little, and we have in many, many ways conspired with our own disempowerment. We now have a situation where the people of the United States and the founders left the power of this country into the hands of the people. But it's not in your hands if it's not in your heart anymore. It's not in your hands if it's not in your mind anymore. And we have allowed ourselves to forget. We have allowed ourselves to be trained to think of ourselves as merely spectators in a horse race. Spectators in a horse race. It's like we need to go to AA or something like that. Like we think, well, can the Republicans handle it or can the Democrats handle it? Who can manage this situation? Well, you and I need to realize neither one of them, the situation has become unmanageable. Within that system, the only place, the founder said, that power is safe, the only repository for democracy is in us. And what has happened is that the main pillars of our democracy, our mission statement, the Declaration of Independence, it's our mission statement. In our mission statement, the principle that all are created equal, and God gave all inalienable rights of life and of liberty in the pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted to secure those rights. And when the government's not doing its job, it is the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. That is our mission statement. That is our mission statement. Is that radical? You betcha. Democracy is radical, and love is radical. And what has happened is that we have lost our psychological and emotional connection to those principles. We inscribe them on marble walls, and they're written in parchment behind glass, and maybe when our kids are in the 8th grade, we can say, well, I sent him, or I sent her to Washington, so she's seen the Declaration of Independence. No, that's not enough. In the Jewish religion, it says that every generation must rediscover God for itself. And the same is true with democracy. Every generation has to rediscover these for ourselves. These principles, if these principles are just on marble walls somewhere, or these principles are written in parchment somewhere, but they're no longer inscribed in our hearts, then they lose their moral force. Principles are only alive if they are alive in us. And so the reemergence of power does not begin in Washington. The reemergence of our power does not begin because it is granted to us by a political establishment. The reemergence of power happens when we ourselves awaken and we realize what in many ways perhaps we should have realized before. You don't take care of your marriage, don't you go being surprised if you lose your marriage. You don't take care of your body, don't you go being surprised you lose your health. You don't take care of your business, don't you go being surprised if you lose your business. And we have now learned, however painfully, in this, the 11th hour, maybe we shouldn't be so surprised. We have not been taking care of our democracy. We have not been taking care of our democracy, and we did not remember what my father used to always tell us, kids, never forget, the bastards are always at the door. And that is true in our personal lives, and it's true in our collective lives. What we know personally, you don't wake up in the morning and give your life to love. You don't wake up in the morning and give your life to compassion. You don't wake up in the morning and give your life to service. You don't wake up in the morning and ask that your life be used for something better than you, higher than you. A higher ideal of that which is good and true and beautiful. You know what's going to happen? That same energy will be used in the service of your neuroses and your pathologies. The energy is going to go somewhere. In a country as powerful as this, if we are not insisting, if we are not vigilant that the powers of this country are used on behalf of the people, what did we expect? All that power was just going to lie there and nobody was going to pick it up for themselves? It has always been true. And in 1776, this country repudiated a system where only a few got to win. We repudiated in 1776 a system where an entire society deemed only a few people entitled. Only a few people were entitled to education. Only a few people were entitled to wealth. Only a few people were entitled to wealth creation. Only a few people were entitled to land. The people themselves did not have the right to pursue happiness. The people themselves were not deemed equal to the upper classes. We repudiated that nonsense in 1776. You know what? It's time to repudiate it again. Because as it turns out, the American Revolution is an ongoing process. You know, the fact that you had your diet or your health or your exercise together 2 years ago doesn't mean you don't have to attend to it now. And that is part of what we're learning from all this. And I think all of us need to recognize that. You know, it is a principle of personal transformation that whenever there is a crisis in your life, one of the first things you have to ask yourself is, how did I participate in this? How did I co-create this? What was my part in this? And the political disengagement of too many Americans who, if we think about it, should have known better, it led us on the path that allowed this to happen. And that includes, ladies and gentlemen, those of us in the higher consciousness community, who allowed some spurious idea of what spiritual means to actually be used as a justification. Let me tell you, there is no religious or spiritual tradition anywhere, nor has there ever been, that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. Now, it's the 11th hour, but it's not midnight yet. I can tell you this, though, we need to do more than elevate the conversation. We need to elevate this country. And that means we need to do a lot more than just defeat Donald Trump. You know, it's not enough not to go over the cliff. We have to get out of the vicinity of the cliff. And in a very real way, I'm not just prosecuting a case against Donald Trump. I'm prosecuting a case against the system that created him. In many ways, our problems were not created by him, our problems created him. The moment we started exalting the businessman, like the businessman was God, that is what has happened in the last 40 years. We have created a false God out of the businessman. The businessman is the creator of our abundance. The businessman is the creator of our good. As soon as we started doing that, you know, when I grew up, the businessman, the businesswoman was no better, no worse than the scientist, no better or worse than the teacher, no better or worse than the artist, no better or worse than anybody else. Who made them so damn important? And once that happened, once we started treating the businessman like the businessman was the creator of all jobs and all abundance, once we did that, you know what? It was almost inevitable that out of that would arise the most twisted, perverse form of businessman. 40 years ago, all this nonsense started. 40 years ago, when this idea of trickle-down economics, that all the American corporation had to do was allow for its fiduciary responsibility to its stockholders. And then even when that fiduciary responsibility to stockholders was at the expense of the workers, at the expense of the community, at the expense of the environment, at the expense of other stakeholders, other shareholders. That's when we started down this dark, amoral path. It wasn't that it was an immoral path, it was an amoral path, but that amoral path, it was inevitable that the amoral path would lead to immoral consequences. Because once you don't care about what the moral issues are, once American capitalism was given a pass on any sense of having a moral or ethical responsibility to people or to planet, everything that has happened almost became inevitable. Now, it's interesting, a very big capitalist organization, the Business Roundtable, just the other day, came out with a statement where it was saying, some of the biggest capitalist moguls in America now saying that this should change. They know that this has got to change. These people are not stupid. They know it won't be because of me or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or anyone else. The young of America will storm those Bastilles if these people do not get there. I'm not someone, I know there's a big conversation in the United States whether or not capitalism is inherently amoral or immoral. I actually don't believe that. I believe that this is a virulent strain of capitalism, and I believe that capitalism, we'll see. But I think these guys have about 2 years to get it together, and if I'm president, that's going to be clear. Because I'm one of those Democrats who wants a U.S. government that holds capitalism accountable. That is why we need to repeal that 2017 $2 trillion tax cut. $2 trillion tax cut, 83 cents of every dollar goes to the very richest Americans and the very, very richest corporations. I think we need to repeal that. We need to put back in the middle-class tax cuts. We need to stop these corporate subsidies, $26 billion last year to the fossil fuel companies alone. We need to end the ridiculous arrangement, talk about immoral, by which the U.S. government gave over its own negotiating rights and does not allow itself to negotiate with big pharmaceutical companies for lower prices. We need to end the fact that right now, although I think we'd all agree, our military should get every single dollar that it needs for legitimate security, it is foolish of us to think that the entire $750 billion military budget is only legitimate security needs and not factor in how many hundreds of billions of dollars have nothing to do with the legitimate security, but have to do with short-term profit maximization for the military-industrial complex. So it's interesting, you're all excited when I see that, but you need to, when I say that, but you need to do more than notice that I said it. You need to notice that I'm only one of 2 presidential candidates who even go close to it. And we also have to say to those who have $1 billion in assets, we'd like 3% of that. We need to say to those who have $50 million or more in assets, we'd like 2% of that. And you know what's going to happen when we do all those things I just said? We're going to have some cash on hand. And let me tell you what we're going to do. Let me tell you what we're going to do when we have that money. First of all, we will have, obviously, universal health care. There's a big question. Because you see, I don't believe that money is created by a bunch of corporate aristocrats who simply drop some crumbs from the table in the form of job creation. Right now, we have one major political party that says, we will drop you some crumbs, and another major political party that says, you don't have to take crumbs, we'll get you a cookie. No, 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 no. We are the American people. Everybody gets to feast here. I don't believe that money comes from a few corporate aristocrats who drop from the table job creation. We'll create you a job. We'll create you a job. We'll create you a job. I see it very differently. The way I look at it, that's what the corporatist says to the citizen. The way I look at it, the citizen needs to say to the corporatist, give me free health care, give me a good education, give me a fair shot, and I'll create my own damn career. Because, you see, I believe that's what government is for. I read the Declaration of Independence, and it said that all men are created equal, and God gave, and I take that one very seriously, all men inalienable rights to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. And governments are instituted to secure those rights. So let's talk about some of those places where government's not doing its job. Millions of American children live with chronic trauma. Millions of American children throughout this country go to school every single day in classrooms that do not even have adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, then the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. If a child lives in a domestic war zone, what's called a domestic war zone in this country, the chances are very good because millions of them do have a form of PTSD, which is considered no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. This, to me, is a humanitarian emergency. These children are American citizens, and even among those who are not American citizens. We have 13 million children in this country who are food insecure. This is the richest country in the world. But 40% of all Americans have to struggle on a daily basis. 40% of all Americans live with chronic economic anxiety, not knowing what will happen if they get sick or if their children get sick, or how they will send their kids to college, or how they will pay off their college loans. The American people should not stand for this. And if you think that somebody just with a better version of same old, defeating Donald Trump and getting in there is going to really seriously interrupt this pattern, then I really do submit to you that you think about this again. What we need to do is to have a United States Department of Children and Youth. That is the plan that I have suggested. It is not enough to simply say we will give more money to education. God knows we need to give more money to education. God knows we need to give more money to teachers. God knows we need to get rid of those high-stakes tests. God knows we need to have smaller classrooms, all of that. But ladies and gentlemen, we have American children who are traumatized before preschool. We have American children who are in elementary school on suicide watch. We need so much more than more money for education. We need so much more than just universal preschool. Those are 20th century conversations. This situation has gotten so dire, we need community wraparound services. We need anti-trauma. We need anti-bullying. We need anti-violence. We need mindfulness in the schools. These people in this traditional, conventional political conversation, they're stuck in the 20th century back there somewhere. They don't seem to get what's happening in this country. I do get what's happening in this country, and you get what's happening in this country, and everywhere I go, people know what's happening in this country. It's time for us to tell politicians we're going to talk about this, not politicians telling us we're going to talk about this, and not mentioning the most important things of all. While we're at it, we should look at the very sobering reality of why they don't talk about it. They don't talk about it because children aren't old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. They don't talk about it because children aren't old enough to work, so they have no financial leverage. So how could they possibly compete with the cloud of all this corporate money that floods through Washington? Not only that, the children that we're talking about, they don't have a very good chance to have any financial clout anyway. Why is that? Because the United States bases the primary source of its funding for education on property taxes. How absurd is that? So if a child lives in a financially advantaged neighborhood in the United States, that child has a very good chance of a high-quality public education. But if a child does not live in a financially advantaged neighborhood in the United States, that child has a decreased probability of a high-quality education. Let me tell you where all of the fuel lies that we need in order to have an amazingly abundant society and economy 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and 30 years from now. I'll tell you where it lies: in the brain of the American child. You want to see potential millions, billions, and trillions of dollars of otherwise unrealized revenue? It's in the brain power of every child. You want to see entrepreneurial genius? Go visit any kindergarten in any neighborhood in this country. The neuroplasticity, the cognitive retention, what happens in the brain of a child under 8 is so far beyond anything that any of us can even do at this point in our lives. Ladies and gentlemen, we need a massive realignment of investment, in the direction of the American child. And if I'm president, we're going to have that. The next place we have to get real and we have to get honest with ourselves has to do with the issue of race. You know, an issue of personal transformation, which also is true in societal transformation because they're the same principles. One of those issues is that you can't have the abundant future that you want unless you're willing to clean up the past. And that's why I want to be president. I want to help this country navigate through this period and end one aberrational chapter of our history and usher in a new one. But you can't do that. Can't do that unless you're willing to get real, and can't do that unless you're willing to clean up, take a fearless moral inventory, admit the exact nature of your character defects. Like a Catholic going to confession, like a Jew on the day of Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year is where you confess your sins. The very, very important issue of having to look yourself in the mirror. This country has to face the fact that we have in racism an original character defect. And we have to take a good look at our history. Now, I don't believe that the average American is a racist. That's not my experience and that's not my belief. But I do believe the average American is woefully undereducated about race in the United States. So if you'll allow me to, let me become a little American history teacher for just a couple of minutes here. In 1619, the first enslaved people landed in Jamestown, Virginia, brought over here and turned into slaves in the United States. That was in 1619. Slavery was not abolished in this country until 1865. That's almost 250 years. At the end of the Civil War, when the slaves were emancipated, it is believed that there were between 4 and 5 million slaves. General Tecumseh Sherman promised to every former slave family of 4, 40 acres and a mule. We've all heard that expression. But I'd like you to join with me in really allowing yourself to think about what that would have meant. So you had been an enslaved person, and now you're told you're free. Okay, where are you supposed to go? What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to feed yourself? How are you supposed to feed your children? So that 40 acres and a mule would have been the way that you had a chance to start over. There were 12 years during Reconstruction, 12 years from 1865 to 1877, where federal troops were stationed in the South to ensure that slavery would not be reinstituted, and a lot of great things happened. There were a lot of black people who were elected to Congress, a lot of black people elected to the Senate, black people elected throughout the states. I mean, it really was 12 years during which time you saw what might have been. Once those troops left, once you had a different kind of president, different kind of government take over in Washington, the full rage of the South at having lost the war came down in full force. And Southern legislatures passed what were called the Black Code laws. And the Black Code laws were to ensure subpar economic, social, and political opportunity for black people. Thus began a reign of terror. So you had 250 years of slavery, followed by what were another 100 years of institutionalized violence against black people. What do you call lynchings and Ku Klux Klan, if not domestic terror? Now, for those 100 years between the end of the Civil War and Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Act, Martin Luther King would say 100 years after the end of the Civil War, they were freed, but what were they freed to? And so in 1964, the United States passed the Civil Rights Act, which dismantled segregation. All of this was because of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1965, the United States Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act ensured equal access to the polls for black people. Now, let's be clear about that as well. 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is while the spate of voter suppression efforts are going on around the country right now. Now, I think that you and I would agree that it's a moral principle. If I've been kicking someone to the ground, and I think we would all agree that 350 years of institutionalized violence against black people is kicking people to the ground. But if you have kicked people to the ground, you have a moral responsibility to do more than just stop kicking. You owe it to them to say, here, let me help you get back up. Many instances of the accumulation of black wealth throughout this country have been thwarted by state laws, federal efforts, local laws, by which even when there has been an effort, even when there has been success at the accumulation of black wealth, often those efforts have been thwarted. I don't want to minimize the extraordinary struggles and success of any of our ancestors, black or white. I'm not saying we've, quote unquote, never done anything. All I'm saying is that there's still a piece that has not been accomplished, and that is economic restitution for the understandable economic gap that existed at the end of the Civil War and that has never been closed. You know, it's an interesting thing because if you have a really fabulous sports car and you're just driving down the street on a regular road, you can't really see what that sports car can do. It's when they get out on the open road, you go, whoa. Same with an airplane. You put that thing in the sky, some jet in the sky, it's like, whoa. But when it's just on the runway or just, it's kind of like this lumbering big piece of metal. That is how I look at the American people. The American people aren't tired because we're doing too much. The American people are tired because we're not doing enough that matters. We are not made for small incremental things. We're made for great things, and it's time for us to do so. you. Thank you. Since World War II, Germany has paid $89 billion to Jewish organizations. That doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen. But those $89 billion, plus a guarantee to Jews that there would be in perpetuity education of all German generations of German children of Holocaust, of the history of the Holocaust, those reparations have gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. Also, I think a lot of people don't realize that in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act. The American Civil Liberties Act, whereby all of the surviving prisoners from the Japanese internment camps were given between $20,000 and $22,000. By the middle of the 20th century, the idea of economic restitution in the form of reparations from one people to another was not considered a fringe notion, and it should not be considered a fringe notion now. The plan that I propose is for $200 to $500 billion to be dispersed over a period of 20 years. This money would be dispersed, filtered through a reparations council made up of scholars and political and cultural leaders who are very aware of the issue of reparations. The stipulation on the part of the American government would be that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. That stipulation is important, and of course the government uses a lot of money. The US government certainly has the right to oversight within that. But within that, how the money is dispersed, whether it's to historical black colleges, whether it is to black chambers of commerce, whether it has to do with venture capital of small businesses, whether it has to do, and who exactly, that should be left to black America. If I owe you money, I don't get to tell you how to spend it. Now, there's a lot of talk about reparations, particularly now, even among the other candidates. So I want you to be very clear of why I want reparations as opposed to, quote unquote, race-based policies. Race-based policies leaves open the question of whose fault it is that this gap exists. And I think an acknowledgement of that is extremely important. That is why reparations carries moral force that race-based policies do not carry. Because reparations contain an inherent mea culpa. There is an inherent recognition of a wrong that has been done, a debt that is owed, and the willingness on the part of one people to pay it to another. That means that the reparations carrying this moral force will convey an emotional and a psychological force that goes beyond simply economic restitution. Now, one of my opponents said the other day, well, you can't just go around giving out checks. She hasn't been in the private sector. You sure as hell can. And so I believe that the whole idea of a plan for reparations is an idea whose time has come. It will not fix everything. Obviously, racial reconciliation is a multidimensional issue. On this, as in so many things, we need an integrative approach to politics. You see, the old political paradigm, the conventional political paradigm is very 20th century, it's very mechanistic. It's like the world is just a machine and you fix it by tinkering with the pieces of the machine, change this policy, change that policy, which doesn't necessarily transform anything, and then the next president come in and repeal that. We need to go deeper. We need to recognize the psychological and emotional and even moral and spiritual imperatives so that things really change, so that we can be the generation after which this country stops passing along like a baton, generation after generation after generation, the toxicity and the turbulence that goes along with a failure to deal with this issue. Let's be the one that can honestly say, on our watch, we made a difference. And now I want to talk to you about America's national security agenda. I find it particularly horrifying that it's not even a conversation within the campaign. The truth of the matter is, obviously, I think we would all agree that we need to have a strong military. We do need to have a strong military. You know, there are some people who say that I am very naive, all this love talk. You know, when I say that the core value of our political functioning should be humanitarian principles rather than economic principles. When I say that all public and domestic and international policy should be based on the core idea that it should be the role of government to help people thrive. That when people thrive, our natural creativity, our natural God-given talents, our natural productivity comes to the fore. That's how you have peace. That's how you have prosperity. There are those who say, I am naive to say that love should be the organizing principle of human civilization. Let me tell you what I say to them. They are naive to think we will even last on this planet another 100 years if we do not make this transition. Martin Luther King said that power without love was reckless and abusive, but that love without power is sentimental and anemic. The love I'm talking about is fierce, and the love I'm talking about knows how to say no when no is what needs to be said. You know, this whole idea of the power of love, and that is really what we're talking about. We need to transition as a human civilization from the love of power to the power of love. Some people say that I'm just a wackadoodle, you know, and I'm very naive about evil. Let me tell you something. They are naive about evil. Those of us who are the most committed to love are the most deeply aware of the power of evil. That's why we insist on love, to prevent it from festering. We're very aware of the power of evil. But just as you can't just take medicine, you also have to cultivate health. You can't just endlessly prepare for war. You also have to cultivate peace. You have to wage peace. Right now, however, we spend $750 billion a year on the military. Then we spend on the State Department $40 billion a year. And that's diplomacy and development and mediation. Now, within the State Department is the USAID, which is humanitarian assistance. That gets $17 billion. And then there are the peace-building agencies, and they get less than $1 billion. Now, what is peace building? First of all, peace-building skills take just as much expertise and sophistication as do military skills. They are the skills, they are the factors which statistically mean that when present, peace, the incidence of peace is increased and the incidence of violent conflict is decreased. Now, when I tell you what these factors are, it's not going to shock anyone. Number one, expanded economic opportunities for women. Number two, expanded educational opportunities for children. Number three, reduced violence against women. And number four, the reduction of unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. For me, core value of my international policy will be the reduction of unnecessary human suffering. We should see large groups of desperate people as a national security risk. Desperate people do desperate things, and desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. Interesting, what geniuses thought that American foreign policy in Latin America wouldn't lead to exactly what is happening now? And so, when you say that all domestic and international policy should be built around the core of helping people thrive, reducing violence, what you get to is what politicians used to talk about when I was a kid. Politicians used to use the phrase all the time, peace and prosperity. We want peace and prosperity. We want peace and prosperity. Now, I asked myself a few years ago, why don't politicians use that phrase anymore? They used to always talk about peace and prosperity. Now, my first thought was, I guess because it's sort of a cliche. And then my second thought was, that's not why they don't talk about it anymore. It's not the goal. Because creating peace, where are the corporate profits there? Creating prosperity for everyone, where are the short-term corporate profits there? Even though long-term, it's how we have a survivable planet. And long-term, it's how we have a prosperous economy. So, ladies and gentlemen, my proposal is for a United States Department of Peace. A United States Department of Peace was first proposed by Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and we all remember who is to many of us a good friend, Dennis Kucinich, which emerged with that idea of a Department of Peace several years ago. And the Department of Peace, when I'm President of the United States, the peace builders will have a place of power at that table. The national... Right now, when they have these national security agenda meetings, all these, these qualified politicians, all those experienced politicians, like the ones who took us into Iraq, all those experienced politicians, like those who took us into Vietnam. The peace builders are not even at the table. They're like peripheral. Not when I'm president. We will rather have a country whose national security agenda contains a robust and equal partnership between those who build peace and those who wage war, if indeed war must come. Now, we have a lot of work to do if any of this is possible. What I have spoken to you about tonight is a moral politics. What I've spoken to you about tonight is a politics that is aligned with what I see to be deep democratic and humanitarian values. If this is to happen, you and I have to give it birth, and birth is not easy. We not only have to give it birth because of those who would seriously oppose everything I'm talking about, but we have to give it birth because everything I'm talking about is obstructed by any conventional political establishment system that is dominated by corporate money. And that's where you and I have to ask ourselves what we're going to do with the rest of our lives. And I think many of us have been very different people. Millions of people in this country have felt everything's different since Donald Trump was elected. I do not believe personally that an insider political game will even defeat the president. This president is not just a politician. This president is a phenomenon. I don't believe an insider political game will defeat him. I know all the candidates are talking about this policy and that policy. The first policy we need is a policy for how to defeat Trump. And right now, the conversation about this policy or that policy is like everybody sharpening their knives. The Republicans are bringing big guns to this battle. They're not bringing knives to this battle. In order to defeat Donald Trump in 2020, we need to not just have an insider political game. We have to have a phenomenon of equal power to what he had. And that phenomenon is not any individual. That phenomenon is not a person. That phenomenon is a collective awakening among the American people. That is the spirit, that is the power, that is the energy out of which emerges the kinds of changes that literally course correct a nation. Donald Trump did not win, and if he were to win again, it wouldn't just be because of people who are passionately supportive of Donald Trump. If he were to win again, it wouldn't be for that reason. The problem is not just people who voted for Trump. The problem is how many people did not vote. The problem is how many people who voted for Jill Stein. The problem is how many people felt, and however you and I might agree that the spirit of rebellion that was expressed there, many of us might have thought that that was not voting, was a dysfunctional form of rebellion. It is still a form of rebellion. In its own way, a system of insistence, I will not participate. We will beat Donald Trump if we give people something to vote for. And if all we give people... If all we do is give people a better version of same old, then even if it were to defeat Donald Trump, those forces that are most dangerous to this country will be back in full force in 22 and in full force in 24. As I said, we need to do more than defeat him. We need to end an aberrational chapter of American history and usher in a new one. That is what we need to do. I read an interview with Jared Kushner, And in the interview, he said that 2 or 3 years ago, now would have been 3 or 4 years ago, he was sitting with his father-in-law at a McDonald's, which, I don't know, that fact just blows my mind. They were at a McDonald's. Anyway, Jared Kushner said to his father-in-law, there are a lot of angry people out there. We could harness all that anger and make you president. And I thought to myself, I see and I know so many wonderful people out there, so many loving people out there, so many dignified people out there, so many decent people out there. We could harness all that and change the world. The problem is not that there are more racists and bigots and homophobes and anti-Semites and xenophobes and Islamophobes in America than there are good, decent, tolerant, non-judgmental people. That's not the problem. The problem is that those of us who think about love and think about character and think about integrity, and I do believe that's the majority of Americans, too often that conversation is kept within the purview of our individual, our personal lives. We need to apply that same level of inquiry to our collective existence as well. And what has happened is that those who represent hate and fear have become politicized. Those worst aspects of the human character have been turned into a political force, which is the most dangerous phenomenon that can ever occur in human civilization. And yet, as I said, it's not like there are more haters than lovers in America. The problem is just that those who hate, hate with conviction. And conviction is a force multiplier. Those of us who love, we need to love now with as much conviction as is that which is now displayed by those who hate. Abraham Lincoln said, as our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. And it's worth noting that when Abraham Lincoln talked about the angels of our better nature, he would not have thought he was being metaphorical. Because 200 years ago, if you were to say to somebody what is the equivalent of racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, etc., people hundreds of years ago would have said, oh, you mean demons. And if you had said, yes, but then there's love and tolerance and kindness and compassion and mercy and justice, they would have said, ah, you mean angels. You see, ladies and gentlemen, we can't fight dog whistles. We have to drown them out with a much more beautiful song. But one thing you have to say about those who hate, they're serious. Those who are Nazis, those who are white nationalists, let's not kid ourselves, those who are terrorists, they're serious. They're not kind of, sort of, sometimes when it's convenient, committed to their goal. They are willing to do whatever it takes to effectuate their worldview. And that's what we have to deal with, and that's what we have to look at within ourselves. Because too often we, and that has been me at times as well, kind of, sort of, sometimes when it's convenient, committed to love. You know, within my comfort zone, committed to love. When it's my child, committed to love. When it's my people, committed to love. The kind of love that will save the world is not just love for our own children. It's love also for the children on the other side of town. It's not just love. It's not just love for our children, it's also love for children on the other side of the world. And so we must expand our sense of what it means to be a citizen, and we must expand our sense of what it means to love. We have to have a great awakening in this country if we're going to have a serious pattern disruption. If we were to have a serious pattern disruption, and certainly my election would be a serious pattern disruption. For this to happen, there certainly needs to be a certain kind of political awakening, but political awakenings have happened in this country before. Abolition has happened, and civil rights movement has happened, and the women's suffragette movement has happened, and the marriage equality movement happened. Yes, we need to identify our problems, but let us identify with the problem solvers in our history. Now, this is not a moment where one person is going to make a difference, or even a few people can make all the difference. That's not the moment that we're in. The zeitgeist of this moment is not about one person or even 10 people. And I lived through the 60s. Don't let it be that, because the system knows how to deal with that. You can't make it just about a few people who are soloists. This revolution is a choir. They cannot shoot a song. And that is what has got to start happening now. You need to sing your song, and you need to sing your song, and you need to sing your song. Each and every one of us have to think of ourselves as immune cells in the body politic. And let me tell you something, Donald Trump is an opportunistic infection, and it could not have gotten hold of us had there not been a weakened societal immune system. Now it's the 11th hour, but it's not midnight yet. Now, what happens with the immune system is what happens in a healthy society. One cell is assigned to the lungs. One cell is assigned to the stomach. One cell is assigned to the brain. One cell is assigned to the heart. One cell is assigned to business. One cell is assigned to science. One cell is assigned to education. One cell is assigned to arts or whatever you're assigned to. Politics is our collective assignment. And as we receive our assignment, each and every one of us, and maybe your assignment will have to do in this election with supporting me. And if it is supporting me, I am deeply honored. At the same time, and California is essentially an early primary state now. I'm not running against anyone, I'm running with a lot of good people. Do your due diligence. Listen to all of them. I'm somebody who thinks it's healthy there are so many of us. It's healthy for our democracy. A lot of good people with some good ideas. So I don't know. I don't know where you're going to land. My job, I'm not trying to tell you, oh, if you vote for me, I'll give you this, or you vote for me, I'll give you that. That's not the race I'm running. I'm telling you, you vote for me, and together we will do something great for this country. That's what I'm telling you. Now, wherever you land, and I hope you're thinking about it deeply, because defeating this president is absolutely essential to the history of our country. On this planet, we only really have two choices ahead. We will have enlightenment or we will have fascism. Those are the two choices that long-term lie ahead. And our generation does have a rendezvous with destiny. When I first realized, and this was before Trump's presidency, this was before 9/11, I realized, I've been writing about this for decades, I realized that our generation was going to be the one, no matter what happened, to make some very, very serious decisions that would affect the future of this planet. We now have a climate crisis, for instance, which literally imperils the survivability of the human race on this planet if we do not deal with this. We must do more than stop it. We must reverse it. We must recognize the deep level of human pathology and dysfunction that would have ever led us to treat the earth the way we have treated it. And when we do realize this, we will realize the level of moral regeneration that must occur. In order for us to change our government, first, you and I must change. Show up, whoever you decide to support. If you decide to support somebody else, just get busy. And if you decide to support me, then please, get busy. Because this is not a moment. This is not a moment when we can afford to do anything less. And I do believe we were born for this time. When I realized years ago that our generation was the generation that was going to hold the fate of humanity in our hands, at first I was very depressed. It was like, oh, I know these people. This is not a good idea. This is not good. But then I began to see things differently. We are a prodigal son generation. The father was more excited to see the son who left and came back than to see the son who had never left. Who among us cannot say with all honesty, we partied? If you don't realize that just living in the United States in our lifetime is a party compared to the plight of most people on the planet, then you don't know at the deepest level what is going on sociologically and politically on this planet. But if you do realize it, and you realize that at the deepest level, what feeds your soul is doing something important. If you feel at the deepest level that what feeds your soul is knowing that you matter. If you feel at the deepest level that what feeds your soul is knowing that you, with others, to your right and to your left, in front of you and behind you, are rising up for a great historic challenge and a great historic mission. And if you feel deep in your soul that, in fact, you were born for this, you have gone around wondering, why the hell was I born? Now you know. For this moment, for this moment, for this moment. So, I honor the fact you're listening to other candidates. I honor the fact you're in process. If you, in fact, land on my candidacy and feel in your heart, this is the one, then I ask that you will join with me. And I ask that you will join with me in working very, very hard. I need you to volunteer. I need you to donate. I need you to do all the things that are necessary in order for a campaign to go forward. We do not have the kind of money that the major contenders at this point have. We do not have the kind of buzz. And God knows they've been working hard at peripheralizing everything about me. Ladies and gentlemen, I've never told someone not to take their medicine. I have never in any moment had an anti-medicine or an anti-science moment. I'm not a wackadoodle. I'm not dangerous. I'm not crazy. I'm not a grifter. I'm not all those things which are so clearly well-designed to make people think that I'm not a legitimate candidate. Let me tell you something. I am a legitimate candidate. Why? I'll tell you why I'm a legitimate candidate. I'm an American. I'm a woman. I'm Marianne Williamson. I'm a citizen of the United States. For the founders, that was good enough. It's good enough for me. I hope it's good enough for you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I am so grateful to you. And before we go out there, and I'll be willing, we can talk out there, I want to introduce you to two fine men and friends of mine. This is Adam Nashban, who is our West Coast fundraiser. This is Steve Bann, who is our head of operations here in California. And they're going to talk to you about the things that we talk about on political campaigns and how you too can be part of this effort. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you. All right, how amazing is that? Wow, guys, right? So as you heard, my name is Steve. I'm the California State Director. We've just heard an amazing speech. We all are asking ourselves, how can we get involved, right? That's right, all right, there's lots of opportunities, and I'm gonna tell you right now, California, it has never been more important to get involved in a political primary, because this is the first time in the history of any of our lives that California has ever mattered in a presidential primary, right? We went from...
Early vote, is that what it's called, early vote?
Right. So if you are registered to vote by mail, right? Who's registered to vote by mail in California? Look at all those hands.
Boom.
That's what I like to see.
Boom.
Yeah. We will be getting our ballots in the mail at the same time as they're voting in Iowa. That means that someone in this room can be the first person to vote in a presidential primary in the whole country. That's amazing, right? So it's our duty to take this seriously, right? We gotta get out there, we gotta talk to our friends, we gotta talk to our families, we gotta do house parties, we gotta figure out ways to get involved with our communities, and we want to get involved with all of you guys. Please, on your way out, there are some lovely volunteers. They have some sign-in sheets. Please sign in those sign-in sheets and sign up to be a volunteer and donate.
Can I interact?
Yeah.
Can I interject?
Yes.
So this is what people don't want to talk about in politics. We all want to see Marianne in the third and fourth debate, correct? Right? So before we get to the primary, we got to make sure that America is still hearing, and the world is still hearing Marianne's voice. And there's one way that you all can help with that. You've shown up today. You're here, you're involved, you're excited, you're cheering, the energy is amazing. We got to make sure that she gets up to that 2% level. And hello, there we go. Thank you, Newman. So we need to make sure that she gets to 2% in 4 polls. That takes time, but that also takes money. And as much as we don't like to talk about it and we don't like to think about it, it's extremely important to making sure that Marianne gets her message out, because this is great and her interviews on CNN are great, and when she goes to the Daily Show and all that stuff, all the national stuff is so wonderful, but we got to make sure that she's talking to individual voters very directly in New Hampshire and in Iowa and in South Carolina and Nevada, so when they open their computers or turn on their televisions or whatever it is, they see Marianne's face. They hear Marianne's message and they say, you know what? I want to vote for her. And we get her up another 1% in the polls. This isn't a lot, but we need your help and we need your money, your contributions. So if you've given $1, give $1 again, please. If you've given $10, give $10 more. If you've given $25, give $25 more. And if you want to know if you want to host a fundraiser or something like that, I'm easy to get a hold of. It's adam@marianne2020.com, and we'd love your support, and thank you so much for coming tonight. So let's go, Marianne. Thank you. Have a good evening.